In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where tradition has ruled for centuries and protocol governs every breath, a single moment shattered everything the royal household thought they knew. When a seasoned royal guard with 20 years of unwavering service suddenly collapsed to his knees, trembling uncontrollably, witnesses couldn't understand what had just happened. Princess Charlotte, barely 8 years old, had done something so unexpected, so completely outside the boundaries of royal behavior, that it left everyone questioning everything they believed about duty, compassion, and what it truly means to serve the crown. The morning of March 15th began like any other at Windsor Castle. The ancient stones seemed to hold their breath in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for another day of carefully orchestrated royal life to unfold. In the guard quarters, Sergeant James Morrison was already awake, as he had been for the past 20 years of his service to the crown. At 45, he carried himself with the rigid posture that came from decades of military discipline, first in the British Army, and then as a member of the elite Royal Protection Unit. James had seen 3 generations of the royal family grow up behind these walls. He had watched Prince William take his first steps in these very corridors, had been present for countless state dinners, royal births, and moments of both triumph and tragedy. His service record was impeccable. Never once had he broken protocol. Never once had he allowed personal feelings to interfere with his duty. To the royal family, he was invisible yet essential, a guardian whose presence was felt but never acknowledged directly. But this morning felt different somehow, though James couldn't quite put his finger on why. As he completed his morning inspection of the security protocols, something nagged at the back of his mind. Perhaps it was the letter he'd received the day before from his own daughter Emma, who was studying abroad. She'd written about feeling homesick, about struggling with her studies, about missing the comfort of family during difficult times. The letter sat folded in his uniform pocket, a small reminder of the life he maintained outside these castle walls. Princess Charlotte had always been different from her brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis. While George carried himself with the natural seriousness that came with being second in line to the throne, and Louis bounced through the castle with the carefree energy of the youngest child, Charlotte occupied a unique space. She was observant in a way that sometimes caught the staff off guard. Where other members of the royal family might look through the help as if they were part of the furniture, Charlotte seemed to actually see them. The staff had noticed this quality in her from a very young age. Mrs. Henderson, who had worked in the royal kitchens for 30 years, often spoke about how Princess Charlotte was the only member of the royal family who consistently thanked her personally for meals. The gardeners mentioned how she would sometimes stop during her walks to ask about the flowers they were tending, genuinely interested in their answers. It was unusual behavior for royalty, who were typically trained from birth to maintain appropriate distance from staff. On this particular morning, Charlotte was supposed to attend her regular tutoring session in the blue drawing room. Her education, like everything else in her life, followed a carefully structured schedule. Mathematics at 9, literature at 10:30, history at 11:15. Each subject was taught by specialists who travelled to the castle specifically to educate the young princess. The routine was as predictable as clockwork, which was exactly how the royal household preferred it. James had been assigned to the corridor detail that morning, which meant he would spend the next several hours standing at his designated position near the main hallway, ensuring the security of the area, while the princess moved between her various appointments. It was a routine assignment, one he performed hundreds of times before. Stand at attention, observe everything, interact with nothing. The golden rule of royal protection was to be completely unobtrusive while remaining constantly vigilant. As the morning progressed, James found his thoughts drifting more than usual. The letter from his daughter weighed on his mind. Emma had always been his pride and joy, the light of his life outside the serious world of royal service. She was studying international relations at university, hoping to work in diplomacy someday. But her recent letters had revealed struggles with anxiety and depression, feelings of isolation that seemed to mirror some of James's own experiences in his demanding career. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days protecting and serving a family while sometimes feeling disconnected from his own. The demands of royal service meant missing birthdays, holidays, and important moments in Emma's life. He'd made these sacrifices willingly, understanding that his duty came first. But lately, the weight of those choices had begun to feel heavier. At precisely 10:20, Princess Charlotte emerged from her mathematics lesson, as she did every Tuesday and Thursday. She walked with the composed manner that had been drilled into her since she could walk, her small hands clasped behind her back, her posture straight despite her young age. Behind her walked Miss Davies, her private secretary, whose job was to ensure the princess stayed on schedule and maintained appropriate behavior at all times. James stood at attention as they passed, his eyes forward, his expression neutral. This was the routine. The princess would walk past, perhaps nod politely in his direction as she'd been taught, and continue to her next appointment. He would remain at his post until his shift ended, then return to his small flat on the castle grounds, where he would write his daily report and perhaps call his daughter if the time zones aligned properly. But today, something changed. As Princess Charlotte approached James's position, she slowed her pace.
Miss Davies, walking slightly behind and reviewing notes for the next lesson, didn't immediately notice.
The princess came to a complete stop directly in front of James, looking up at him with an expression that seemed far too serious for an 8-year-old child.
Sergeant Morrison, she said quietly, using his proper title in the way she'd been taught to address all staff members. James's training kicked in immediately. He was not supposed to engage in conversation with members of the royal family unless directly addressed on matters of security. Even then, responses were meant to be brief and professional. But something in the princess's tone made him look down at her, meeting her eyes for perhaps the first time in all his years of service. "Your Highness," he replied, his voice steady despite a growing sense that something unusual was happening. Princess Charlotte studied his face for a long moment, her young features creased with concern.
"You look sad today,"
she said simply. "Are you all right?" The question hit James like a physical blow. In 20 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked about his personal well-being. They weren't supposed to. It wasn't part of the carefully maintained boundaries that kept the monarchy functioning. Staff served, royalty accepted that service, and personal feelings remained completely separate from professional duty. "I'm quite well, Your Highness," James replied automatically, falling back on the standard response he'd been trained to give. "Thank you for asking." But Princess Charlotte didn't move along as expected. Instead, she continued to study his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Miss Davies had finally noticed that the princess had stopped and was approaching with the slightly harried expression of someone whose carefully planned schedule was being disrupted. "Your Highness, we really must continue to your literature lesson," Miss Davies said diplomatically. "Professor Williams is waiting." Princess Charlotte held up one small hand, a gesture that somehow carried surprising authority despite her age. "In a moment, Miss Davies," she said, never taking her eyes off James. "Sergeant Morrison, you have a daughter, don't you?" James felt his heart skip. How could she possibly know that? His personal life was supposed to be completely separate from his professional duties. Royal protection officers were trained to be invisible, their private lives irrelevant to their service. But somehow, this 8-year-old princess had not only noticed his emotional state, but also knew about Emma. "Yes, Your Highness," he said carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. "Is she well?" Charlotte asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she already knew the answer. James felt something crack inside his chest. The professional armor he'd built up over 20 years of service suddenly felt paper thin. "She's having some difficulties at university, Your Highness." "Nothing that should concern you." Miss Davies stepped forward again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Royal family members simply didn't discuss personal matters with staff. It wasn't proper, and it certainly wasn't something that should be happening in a public corridor where other staff members might overhear. But Princess Charlotte ignored her secretary's obvious discomfort. Instead, she did something that completely shattered every protocol James had ever learned about royal behavior. She reached out and took his hand. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely against everything he'd been taught about appropriate boundaries between royalty and staff, that James felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. Her small hand was warm in his, and the simple human contact carried more comfort than he'd felt in months. "I'm sorry she's struggling," Charlotte said quietly. "It must be very hard for you to be away from her when she needs you." Those words, spoken with genuine compassion by an 8-year-old who had somehow seen through all his professional defenses, broke something fundamental inside James. The weight of 20 years of service, of missed moments with his daughter, of maintaining emotional distance from the people he protected, suddenly crashed down on him all at once. His vision blurred. His hands began to shake. The corridor that had been so familiar, so controlled, suddenly felt like it was tilting around him. He tried to maintain his composure, tried to fall back on his training, but the simple act of kindness from this young princess had unlocked emotions he'd been suppressing for years.
Miss Davies gasped as she realized what was happening.
Other staff members in the corridor stopped what they were doing, staring in shock as the unthinkable unfolded before them. Sergeant James Morrison, one of the most respected and reliable members of the Royal Protection Unit, was breaking down in front of Princess Charlotte, his professional facade crumbling like ancient stone. And through it all, the 8-year-old princess stood perfectly still, holding his hand, her young face filled with a compassion that seemed far beyond her years. In that moment, every rule about royal protocol, every boundary between the served and those who serve, every carefully maintained tradition that kept the monarchy functioning, seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of simple human kindness. The morning that had started like any other had become something none of them would ever forget, and James Morrison realized that his 20 years of faithful service had just been transformed by the unexpected compassion of a child who saw him not as an invisible guardian, but as a human being deserving of care and concern. The silence in the corridor stretched like a held breath as James Morrison fought to regain control of himself. Princess Charlotte's small hand remained steady in his, an anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him completely. Around them, the normal rhythm of castle life had ground to a halt. Footmen who had been going about their morning duties stood frozen, uncertain how to react to a scene that had no precedent in royal protocol. Miss Davies cleared her throat nervously, her training warring with her human instincts. On one hand, she knew that what was happening was completely inappropriate by royal standards. Staff members simply did not have emotional breakdowns in front of members of the family, and royalty certainly did not provide comfort by holding hands with employees. On the other hand, she could see the genuine distress on James's face, and the equally genuine compassion radiating from the young princess. "Your Highness," Miss Davies said softly, trying to strike a balance between respect and urgency, "perhaps we should help him." Charlotte interrupted, her voice carrying a quiet determination that stopped her secretary mid-sentence. "Can't you see he's hurting?" The simplicity of the statement hit everyone present like a revelation. Here was an 8-year-old child, born into immense privilege and trained from birth in the complex rules of royal behavior, cutting through all the protocol and tradition to focus on the most basic human truth. Someone was in pain and needed help. James tried once more to pull himself together, drawing on decades of military training and professional discipline. "Your Highness, I apologize," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "This is highly inappropriate. I should return to my duties." But when he tried to gently extract his hand from Charlotte's grasp, she held on more firmly. "No," she said with surprising authority for someone so young. "You don't need to apologize for being human, Sergeant Morrison. My papa always says that the people who protect us are the most important people in our lives, but sometimes I think we forget that you have lives too." The reference to Prince William caught everyone's attention. It suggested that conversations about the royal staff took place within the family, that the invisible guardians and servants were perhaps not as invisible as they believed. It also revealed something about Charlotte's upbringing that went beyond traditional royal education. She was being taught to see the humanity in those who served her family. Mrs. Henderson, the head cook who had been passing through the corridor with a tea service for the princess's upcoming lesson, set down her tray and approached cautiously. She had worked at the castle longer than anyone present and had developed a grandmother's instinct for situations that required immediate attention rather than strict adherence to protocol. "Your Highness," she said gently to Charlotte, "perhaps Sergeant Morrison would benefit from sitting down for a moment." "The morning room is just here, and it's quite private." It was a diplomatic suggestion that offered a solution to the immediate crisis while maintaining some semblance of propriety. The morning room was indeed private, away from the main corridors where other staff members and potentially other family members might witness the unprecedented scene. Charlotte looked up at James, her young face creased with concern. "Would that help?" "We could sit quietly for a few minutes and you could tell me about your daughter if you'd like. I promise I won't tell anyone anything you don't want me to tell." The offer was so unexpectedly mature, so genuinely caring, that James felt his emotional defenses crumble further. Here was a child who had been born into one of the most powerful families in the world, offering him the same kind of comfort he might have given to his own daughter during a difficult moment. "I don't want to trouble you with my personal concerns, Your Highness," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. The truth was that he desperately needed someone to talk to. Someone who might understand the unique pressures of service and sacrifice. "It's not trouble," Charlotte replied simply. "It's friendship." That single word, friendship, hung in the air like a foreign concept. Royal family members did not have friendships with staff. They maintained polite, respectful relationships built on mutual duty and discretion, But actual friendship implied an equality that simply didn't exist within the traditional structure of the monarchy. Yet as Princess Charlotte led James toward the morning room, still holding his hand with the natural ease of a child who hadn't yet learned that such gestures were impossible, everyone present began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a glimpse into a different way of understanding the relationships between those who serve and those who are served. The morning room was indeed private, decorated in soft blues and yellows that created a calming atmosphere. Tall windows looked out over the castle gardens, where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom despite the lingering chill in the air. Charlotte guided James to one of the comfortable armchairs near the window, then surprised everyone further by climbing into the chair across from him, rather than maintaining the standing position that protocol would typically require. Miss Davies hovered uncertainly in the doorway, clearly torn between her duty to maintain the princess's schedule and her recognition that something important was happening. Mrs. Henderson had followed them into the room and was quietly preparing tea, her experienced hands moving automatically while her mind tried to process the extraordinary scene unfolding before her. "Now then," Charlotte said, settling herself in the chair with the same serious demeanor she brought to her studies. "Tell me about your daughter. What's her name?" James looked around the room, taking in the faces of the staff members who had become unexpected witnesses to his moment of vulnerability. He saw no judgment in their expressions, only concern and a kind of wondering amazement at the princess's behavior. Finally, he looked back at Charlotte, who was waiting with patient attention for his response. "Her name is Emma," he said quietly. "She's 19, and she's studying at Cambridge. International relations. She wants to be a diplomat someday." Charlotte's face lit up with genuine interest. "That's wonderful. She must be very clever to get into Cambridge. You must be so proud of her." "I am," James replied, and for the first time in months, he smiled when thinking about his daughter. "She's always been brilliant, much smarter than her old father. But lately she's been struggling with anxiety and homesickness."
University can be overwhelming, and I think she feels very alone there. Does she know how proud you are of her?
Charlotte asked, the question coming from a place of genuine curiosity rather than judgment.
The question hit James harder than he expected. I hope so. I try to tell her, but my work here means I can't visit her very often. Sometimes weeks go by between our phone calls, and when we do talk, I'm often tired or distracted by my duties here. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, as if she were considering a complex problem. "That must be very difficult for both of you. My papa is often busy with his duties too, but Mama makes sure we know that we're the most important thing to him, even when he can't be with us." The simple wisdom of the observation struck everyone in the room. Here was a child who understood instinctively that love needed to be demonstrated and communicated, not just felt. She had identified the core of James's struggle without him having to explain it fully. "I worry that I've been so focused on my duty to protect your family that I've failed in my duty to my own daughter," James admitted, the words coming out in a rush as if speaking them aloud might somehow make them less true. "Oh, but that's not right at all," Charlotte said firmly. "You haven't failed anyone. You've been taking care of us so well that we've all been safe and happy, and your daughter knows that what you do is important, even if it means you can't always be with her the way you'd like." Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly listening while preparing the tea service, found herself wiping away tears. In her 30 years at the castle, she had never seen anything like this young princess's natural ability to comfort and counsel someone in distress. It was as if Charlotte possessed an emotional intelligence that far exceeded her chronological age.
"But what if she doesn't know?" James asked, voicing the fear that had been eating at him for months.
What if she thinks I care more about my job than I do about her?
Charlotte considered this question seriously, her young brow furrowed in concentration.
"Then you need to tell her," she said finally. "But not just with words. You need to show her in a way that she'll understand." "How do you mean, Your Highness?" "Well," Charlotte said, settling back in her chair as if she were about to share a great secret. "When Papa has to travel for his duties and can't be with us, he always finds a way to let us know we're still the most important thing to him. Sometimes he sends us letters with drawings, or he calls to read us bedtime stories, even if it's the middle of the day where he is. And Mama helps us make special things to send to him, so he knows we're thinking about him too." The idea was so simple, yet James realized he had never thought to approach his relationship with Emma in such a deliberate way. His communications with his daughter had become routine check-ins, focused on practical matters and brief updates rather than meaningful connections. "Last Christmas," Charlotte continued, "Papa was supposed to be at a very important meeting, but he left early to come home and help us build a snowman in the garden. He said that no meeting could be more important than making memories with us. Maybe you could do something like that with your daughter." James felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of guilt and regret that had been growing there for months.
"You think she would understand if I took some time off to visit her?" "I think," Charlotte said with the wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond her 8 years, "that she would understand that her father loves her enough to put her first sometimes. And I think that's what she needs to know most of all." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Charlotte asking thoughtful questions about Emma's interests and struggles, offering suggestions with the kind of innocent clarity that only children possess. She spoke about her own experiences with feeling overwhelmed by expectations, about the comfort she found in knowing her parents prioritized her well-being over their duties when necessary. Miss Davies, who had initially been horrified by the complete abandonment of the morning schedule, found herself taking notes on her tablet. Not about missed appointments and protocol violations, but about the remarkable insights emerging from this unprecedented conversation between a princess and her protector. When Charlotte finally announced that she was ready to continue with her lessons, the atmosphere in the morning room had been completely transformed. James sat straighter in his chair, his eyes clearer than they had been in months. The crushing weight of isolation and guilt that had been overwhelming him that morning had been replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. "Sergeant Morrison," Charlotte said as she prepared to leave, "will you promise me something?"
Of course, Your Highness. Promise me that you'll call your daughter today and tell her about our conversation.
Not the specific details, of course, but tell her that talking to a friend helped you realize how much she means to you. And promise me that you'll ask Papa if you can take some time to visit her soon. The casual way she referred to Prince William as Papa in the context of James's professional request was another small revolution in protocol. She was suggesting that James approach her father not as a subject petitioning royalty, but as one parent speaking to another about the importance of family. "I promise, Your Highness," James said, and he meant it completely. As Princess Charlotte left the morning room to continue her education, she paused at the door and looked back at James one final time. "Sergeant Morrison," she said quietly, "you're a good father. Don't ever doubt that." And with those words, she transformed not just James's understanding of his relationship with his daughter, but everyone present's understanding of what it meant to serve and be served with genuine humanity and care. The remainder of that extraordinary day passed in a blur of quiet transformation. James Morrison returned to his duties with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, but more than that, he carried with him the echo of Princess Charlotte's words and the memory of her small hand in his. The other staff members who had witnessed the morning's events moved through their responsibilities with a different energy, as if they had all been reminded of something fundamental about their humanity that had been temporarily forgotten in the routine of royal service. Word of what had happened spread through the castle, in the way that significant events always do in close communities. Not as gossip or scandal, but as something remarkable that needed to be understood and processed. The head butler, Mr. Bobble Ainsworth, who had been serving the royal family for over 30 years, found himself having conversations with long-time staff members about the unique nature of Princess Charlotte's character and what it might mean for the future of the monarchy. "She sees us," Mrs. Henderson told him as they reviewed the day's events in the staff quarters that evening. "Really sees us not just as people who do things for her family, but as people who have our own lives and concerns and feelings."
Mr.
Ainsworth nodded thoughtfully. He had served 3 generations of the royal family and had observed the subtle differences in how each member related to those around them. "It's more than that," he said. "She understands that our well-being matters, that it's connected to how well we can serve. That's a level of emotional intelligence that's quite rare, even among adults." True to his promise, James called his daughter Emma that evening. The conversation was unlike any they had shared in recent memory. Instead of the usual brief exchange of updates and practical information, James found himself really listening to his daughter's concerns and sharing his own feelings about the distance between them.
Dad, you sound different, Emma said partway through their call.
"I can't explain it, but you sound lighter somehow." James smiled, thinking of Princess Charlotte's remarkable ability to cut through complexity and focus on what truly mattered. "I had an interesting conversation today that helped me realize some things about what's really important. Emma, I want you to know that you are the most important thing in my life. More important than my job or anything else." "I know that, Dad," Emma replied, but there was a note of surprise in her voice that suggested she hadn't been entirely certain. "I'm going to make sure you really know it," James continued. I'm going to request some leave time so I can come visit you at Cambridge.
We can spend a proper weekend together, maybe explore some of the places you've been wanting to show me. The joy in Emma's voice when she responded was worth more than any commendation James had ever received in his professional career. They talked for over an hour, really talked, in a way they hadn't done since she was a child. When he finally hung up the phone, James felt as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. The next morning brought its own set of challenges. James woke with the knowledge that he needed to approach Prince William about taking leave, something that seemed much more daunting in the clear light of day than it had in the emotional warmth of the previous afternoon's conversation with Charlotte. Royal protection officers simply didn't request time off for personal reasons, especially not with the casual confidence that the princess had suggested. But as James prepared for his morning duties, he remembered Charlotte's words about approaching her father as one parent speaking to another. The idea seemed revolutionary, yet there was something about the princess's absolute certainty that made it feel possible.
The opportunity arose sooner than expected. Prince William appeared in the corridor outside his study, reviewing his schedule for the day with his private secretary. James was stationed nearby as part of his regular duties, and when the prince finished his conversation and dismissed his secretary, he noticed James and approached him directly. Sergeant Morrison, Prince William said, his tone friendly but professional. Charlotte mentioned yesterday that you have a daughter at Cambridge. How is she getting on? The question caught James off guard, though he realized it shouldn't have. Princess Charlotte had clearly spoken to her father about their conversation, which meant that Prince William was already aware of the previous day's unprecedented interaction. She's doing well academically, sir, James replied carefully, though she's been struggling a bit with the adjustment to university life. Prince William nodded understandingly. It's a difficult transition for many young people. Cambridge can be particularly challenging, given its academic intensity. I imagine it must be hard for you as well, being unable to provide the kind of support you'd like to offer. There it was. The opening that Princess Charlotte had somehow known would appear. Prince William wasn't speaking as the future king to one of his protection officers. He was speaking as one father to another, acknowledging the universal challenges of parenting and the particular difficulties that came with careers that demanded significant personal sacrifice. It has been challenging, sir, James admitted. I'd been thinking that it might be beneficial if I could visit her, spend some quality time together to help her feel more settled and supported. I think that's an excellent idea, Prince William replied without hesitation. When were you hoping to arrange this visit? James felt a surge of relief, mixed with amazement. The conversation that he had been dreading was turning out to be remarkably straightforward, thanks to the groundwork laid by an 8-year-old princess who had somehow understood exactly how to create the conditions for success. If it's possible, sir, I was hoping to take a long weekend in the coming weeks. I would ensure that all my duties are properly covered. Of course. Consider it arranged, Prince William said firmly. And James, please don't feel that you need to apologize for having priorities outside of your service here. The people who protect my family make enormous sacrifices, and it's important to me that you maintain the relationships and connections that sustain you. A protection officer who is fulfilled in his personal life is someone who can serve more effectively professionally. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Prince William asking thoughtful questions about Emma's studies and expressing genuine interest in her aspirations for diplomatic service. When they parted, James felt not only relieved but genuinely appreciated, in a way that went far beyond the professional recognition he typically received. Later that afternoon, James encountered Princess Charlotte in the corridor again, this time during her scheduled walk between tutoring sessions. When she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire hallway. Sergeant Morrison, she said, approaching him with the same directness she had shown the day before, did you speak with your daughter? I did, Your Highness, James replied, unable to suppress his own smile. We had a wonderful conversation, and I'm going to visit her at Cambridge next weekend. Charlotte clapped her hands together with delight, a gesture so spontaneous and childlike that it reminded everyone present that beneath her remarkable maturity, she was still just 8 years old. Oh, that's wonderful. She must be so excited. She is, James confirmed. And I have you to thank for helping me realize what was truly important. Princess Charlotte shook her head seriously. You don't need to thank me, Sergeant Morrison. You just needed someone to remind you of what you already knew in your heart. Sometimes we all need friends to help us see clearly. There was that word again. Friends.
In the 24 hours since Charlotte had first used it, the concept had taken root in James's mind and begun to reshape his understanding of his relationships within the royal household. The idea that he could be valued not just as a professional protector, but as a human being, worthy of friendship and concern, was transformative. Miss Davies, who was once again accompanying the princess, smiled as she watched the interaction. The previous day's anxiety about protocol violations had been replaced by a growing appreciation for her young charge's remarkable ability to connect with people across traditional boundaries. She had even included a note in her daily report to the senior staff about Princess Charlotte's exceptional emotional intelligence and natural leadership qualities.
Your Highness, James said carefully, I hope you know how much your kindness meant to me yesterday. It's something I'll never forget. Charlotte looked up at him with those remarkably mature eyes.
Sergeant Morrison, can I tell you something my mama taught me?
Of course, Your Highness. She told me that being born into our family means we have special responsibilities, but the most important one isn't about ceremonies or duties or protocol. It's about remembering that every person we meet has a heart that can be hurt and healed, dreams that can be supported or crushed, and a life that matters just as much as ours does. She said that real leadership isn't about making people serve you. It's about serving them right back by caring about their well-being. The wisdom embedded in those words struck everyone who heard them. Here was a child who had been taught that privilege came with the obligation to care for others, not just to accept their care.
It was a lesson in leadership that many adults never learned, delivered with the clear-eyed honesty that only children possess. 3 weeks later, James returned from his visit to Cambridge with stories about long walks through the historic college grounds, conversations with Emma about her studies and dreams, and the kind of quality time together that had been missing from their relationship for too long.
Emma had introduced him to her friends, shown him her favorite spots in the city, and most importantly, they had reconnected as father and daughter rather than as two people trying to maintain a relationship across the demands of duty and distance. The change in James was visible to everyone at the castle. He carried himself with renewed energy and purpose, and his interactions with both colleagues and the royal family were marked by a warmth and presence that hadn't been there before. His protection duties remained as professional and competent as ever, but there was a humanity in his service that made everyone around him feel more valued and seen. Princess Charlotte, meanwhile, continued her education and royal duties with the same remarkable combination of seriousness and compassion that had made such an impact on that extraordinary morning. But those who worked closely with her noticed something new in her interactions with staff members, a confidence in her ability to make a positive difference in people's lives, and a growing understanding of the real meaning of royal service. The incident became something of a legend within the castle walls, not because it was scandalous or inappropriate, but because it represented something genuinely hopeful about the future of the monarchy. Here was a young princess who understood instinctively that true leadership meant caring about the whole person, not just their professional function. She had demonstrated that compassion and protocol were not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the most important royal duty was simply to be human with other human beings. Ainsworth, in his final report before retirement 6 months later, wrote about the extraordinary morning when Princess Charlotte had shown them all what it meant to serve with genuine care and to lead with authentic compassion. He noted that in all his years of royal service, he had never seen a single act of kindness create such positive change throughout the entire household.
Her Royal Highness Princess Charlotte, he wrote, possesses that rarest of gifts, the ability to see past roles and responsibilities to the human hearts beneath. If she carries this quality into her adult royal duties, she will transform not just how the monarchy serves the British people, but how all of us understand what it means to truly serve one another. James Morrison continued his distinguished career in the Royal Protection Unit, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of the balance between professional duty and personal fulfillment. His relationship with his daughter flourished, built on a foundation of open communication and mutual understanding that began with a conversation prompted by the compassionate insight of an 8-year-old princess. And Princess Charlotte continued to grow and learn within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle, carrying with her the knowledge that the most important royal duty of all was to remember that every person deserves to be seen, valued, and cared for as a complete human being. In years to come, that lesson would shape not just her own approach to royal service, but the very future of the British monarchy itself. The morning that had begun with protocol and routine had ended with transformation and hope, proving that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures or formal declarations, but from the simple willingness to extend human kindness across the artificial boundaries that separate us from one another. Royal Guard overcome by shock. Following Princess Charlotte's surprising move, why did he do this?